from Steve, and he asks, why do preachers refuse to answer the how, as in how do we love God and our love our neighbors? He says, not coming from a complete immersion in churchianity, I don't get it. Well, Steve, I'll do my best to answer this. This is kind of a tricky one. This is not so much, kind of a chapter verse type thing, but this is more of a philosophy as to why, I, believe why they may not be answering it. And of course, I'm having to generalize because this is a very, very broad question. I get what you're saying. But I think it is quite broad. So, I think to some extent, sometimes, a lot of times preachers really do answer the how. Most Christians that I've met are pretty nice people by and large, okay? And, they'll talk about being kind to people, helping your, you know, grandmother across the road, and and doing what we might call Christian kind of things, all right? Turning the other cheek, etc. But because I know you, I think what is behind your question is, why is it that when we want to suggest that the God's instructions are giving us the how, as in how to love one another, why is that quite often rejected? In other words, when you look at the Ten Commandments are all about loving God and loving your neighbor, right? Take, for example, don't murder. That seems pretty obvious, right? If I love my neighbor, I'm not going to kill him, right? That's the first thing to consider. If I love my neighbor, I'm not going to rob him. If I love my neighbor, I won't commit adultery with his wife. You get the point here, right? If I love God, then I won't take his name in vain. If I love God, I won't have any other gods before him. All right. So this is the idea. But what happens though is when we come to that fourth commandment, the one about keeping the Sabbath, suddenly, no, that's not how you do it. And then we often do hear a type of turnaround where or suddenly pastors don't feel comfortable. And again, I'm speaking very broadly. I'm not saying all of them all the time, but more often than not, this is the kind of response that we get from a lot of evangelical kind of pastors. So the reason I would suggest, if we go back to a fellow named Marcion, he was Marcion of Sinope, Turkey. He lived in the 2nd century AD, and he was the one that gave us the concept of the Old Testament versus the New Testament. He coined those phrases. Those terms did not exist before Marcion. He gave us the idea that there was a God of the Old Testament who was a demiurge, who was a God who foisted this thing called the law onto the backs of the Jews. And then finally it was Jesus that came along and died on the cross, thereby releasing humanity from the terrible obligations of the law. And according to Marcion, the only disciple or apostle that really understood this, that got the message, was the apostle Paul. All of the other disciples did not get this message, but Paul understood it, according to Marcion. And so what I think happens is, based on this infiltration of Marcion. I like to call it the ghost of Marcionism, or I have a video called Haunted Theology, and I go into great detail. And if you're interested, I would really encourage everyone to check out that video, Haunted Theology and the Ghost of Marcion. It's here on YouTube, so you can check that out. And I go into a lot of detail as to why. Well, I don't know why Marcion said that, but that is what he said. It's very much on record. And the early heresiologists were trying to get rid of this guy. They're trying to stamp out his heresy, but they could not do it. And his heresy lived on till at least the 5th or 6th, probably the 6th century. We still see that it's alive and well. And then it doesn't. We don't really hear about it. My theory as to why we don't hear about Marcionism anymore is because it just becomes part of the Christian theology. People don't realize who they're fighting against anymore. And I would suggest that Marcionism kind of won the day. I would suggest that Marcionism just took root and it became part of our Christian doctrine. And I've been to enough evangelical churches, and I've heard enough sermons, and when I compare it with Marcionism, many times they're very similar. You go to a lot of Sunday kind of churches, they'll very much say that the Sabbath was done away with. Sometimes they will say that the law was nailed to the cross. I was at a Calvary Chapel in Southern California, and the pastor was going through Colossians chapter 2, and then he came to that amazing verse there in verse 15, and he said that the law was nailed to the cross. And I went up to him later after the service, and I asked him, I wanted to be really clear. I said, are you saying that God's commandments, the very things that he spoke at Mount Sinai, were nailed to the cross? And he looked at me, he kind of looked up in the air thinking about it, and he's like, yeah, that's exactly what I mean. So that's the unfortunate reality, I think, that we live in. And so a lot of pastors are stuck in that mentality. I was there as well, and so I can understand where they're coming from. I don't agree with it, but I understand where they're coming from. And I would suggest that is why we're not going to have a really clear list, because of Marcionism, and because Marcion only accepted Paul and bits of Luke, but he highly rejected that. But he rejected the entire Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, and he rejected most of the New Testament, and he kept only Paul and only the portions of Paul that he liked. And that is what is so often taught. I think that is why pastors will not discuss that. So